Hi everyone, this is the water pump and reinstallation procedures performed on a 2004 Chrysler Sebring with a 2.7 liter engine. I'm sure it's applicable to multiple model years, and it's also applicable, I guess you could say, to the Intrepid, which has the same engine, but it's mounted, it's a rear-wheel drive car, so it's mounted the other way. The process is significant in its involvement, and the time commitment is pretty high for most people. You can expect to spend 2 to 3 days in the process. I'm able to do it in one day and be done before dinner, but that's because I've done it before and I've got all the tools and I know which tools to use and so on and so forth. So give yourself ample time if you've never done anything like this before. Essentially, what has to be done is there is the intake manifold on top, pictured here, has to be removed along with both valve covers. The cooling system needs to be drained. The front cover has to come off. The timing chain has to be removed. It's very difficult to remove the pump without removing the chain. Tensioner has to come out. Guides have to come out for the chain because this is a chain-driven water pump. And then the pump can be accessed at that point, and then reverse the procedure to install. So that's why it takes so long and it's rather involved.
First thing we did was remove the plastic cover from inside the wheel area here. If you want to disconnect the battery, you have to do that from the other side, removing the wheel and removing clips or bolts from the inner fender well to get to it. So the first step is I'm going to remove the tensioner pulley for the serpentine belt, the outer serpentine belt, which runs the AC compressor and the alternator, and the mount bolt for the harmonic balancer. And to get that bolt out, you want to remove the, unless you have an impact, you're going to remove this bracket. It's a support bracket between the transmission and the engine. Above that is an inspection cover with 10mm headed bolts so that you can put a pry bar in there holding the starter ring gear still while you use I believe it's a 17mm socket to remove that nut. So here's the tensioner. There's a pivot bolt, a sliding adjustment bolt, 13mm. Pretty easy to get out, especially if you just go ahead and take this one all the way out. Then you can get that one out and the whole thing falls out. And you might want to pay attention to the belt routing. There is a label under the hood and it shows you the routing of it. But what you have is it's coming down off the alternator, around the crank, up to the compressor, around the pulley, and back to the alternator again. The condition that we have is what appears to be a leaking water pump. Even though the pump is underneath this cover, there's no leakage here. There's a weep hole that's actually further back that will leak from this area here and down onto the pan area. That's just the way the pump's designed. It doesn't leak into the interior cavity there where the timing belt is. So it's a bit tricky, I think, to diagnose. There's a plastic housing just to the right of the weep hole, and that's an inlet, and the thermostat housing is in there as well, which I can show you what that looks like. So that's this. There's the thermostat with the gasket. So it sits in there like this, and the notch at the bottom here, that's where the weep hole is. It's extremely difficult to see, but at just the right angle from underneath the car, you can get eyes on where that weep hole is. I should probably explain. The weep hole is it's a hole that's at the bottom of the water pump, and what it does is it gives the coolant a place to go when that seal at the pump shaft starts to fail, which often it's because the bearing begins to fail or the bushing that the pump rides in, and that causes the seal to wall her out a little bit, and then it starts leaking.
To get the bolt off of the harmonic balancer, you gotta lock the crankshaft in place unless you have an impact. So for this job I didn't have that, so I just used a 1/4 inch extension bar with the inspection cover removed from the transmission bell housing, and just rotate the engine over until I found there's several holes in the flex plate, and just slid this into one of the holes, and it jammed the extension bar up against the engine block, actually the oil pan, and then I could break the bolt loose on the harmonic balancer.
So we had to to remove the pulley. It is a press fit, so pry bars don't work. You got to get a puller. The Napa puller didn't work, so we ended up with a puller from AutoZone. It's pretty straightforward. It's got a bolt with a hole in it, then they give you extensions, so you slide this in there, run this through your puller, and then you hook on to the innermost portion here and to pull it off. 27,139. Alright, so in getting to this, you can take this hose back so that you can get down. There's a bolt up on top on this cover that has to come out in order for you to get the front cover off. To do that, it's almost easier just to pull this bottle out of the way so you've got some room to bring that back. In our case, I guess this is kind of a common deal. These break. These are, you know, it's a housing for your temperature sensor and your bleeder, and so we're gonna have to replace this anyway. The order is to lift the intake manifold, and so you just go through and take the bolts out. And there's one more back here underneath the cover where the 2 throttle cables come in. Next, we're taking the power steering pump out so we can get to the hydraulic tensioner, which screws in from the driver's right side of the block, I guess that would be, which is the one that's close to the firewall. So there's a couple bolts that you get to from underneath with a 13 and a long extension, and that takes the bracket loose, because just removing the pump from the bracket is nearly impossible without taking the bracket out. And there's the final bolt just in front of that tab, and it's probably a 15mm that holds that the top of the front cover on. So with maybe a little more effort than what should be necessary, that upper bolt, finally got that out. There's an engine pickup point. Looks like it's tied into that right there. But anyway, it takes that out. So I ended up taking the water bottle out. There was just a lot of hoses laying on top of it. It's easier just to get in there and do that. Also, this upper hose is for the power steering, which is, it's pretty easy to unbolt that. It's just one bolt that holds that reservoir down. You can move that up out of the way. And then the lower hose is a hard line for coolant. And there's 2 bolts that hold that in place. There's one up at the front, up against the body, and the other one is down here in the back in the same spot. Both of them are pretty easy to get to with 10mm. That just gives you some room to get the mount to move, so you can clear this bolt to get the cover out. I still don't have the mount out, but I don't think we really need to take it out all the way. Just going to go with that.